Hello everybody, welcome to Alan History Nerd. Today I am going to be comparing the UK and the US constitutions. Now in a lot of ways they just seem to be fundamentally different and exist in completely different ways, but there are degrees of similarity in there, and we're going to explore different approaches to comparing them and looking at them in a whole variety of different ways. So this is related to the A-level spec 6.21 and 6.22. So 6.21 tells us compare and debate the following aspects of the UK and US constitutions and the resulting impact on politics and government, their nature, codified, uncodified, their sources, provisions and principles, including separation of powers and checks and balances. So I'm going to do all of that. Similarities and differences between the US federal system and the UK system of devolution, so we'll look at that as well. And then finally, the extent to which rational, cultural and structural approaches can be used to account for these similarities and differences. And obviously that's the key bit in case it turns up in question 2, which is the 12-mark question that requires you to use these different approaches, the cultural, rational and structural approach in terms of accounting for these things. Already on the channel there are a series of videos on the US Constitution, doing that in more detail, and also there's video on the UK Constitution, looking at that in more detail. There are also videos on the different types of 12-mark questions, and all of that should be really helpful in terms of actually doing a question on this. And again, I will go through the key bits on here, but there are those other resources available on Alan History Nerd to help you with that. So the first bit is, I think, probably the most obvious and definitely the most crucial, which is this difference between a codified and uncodified constitution. Now, essentially what this is about is that the US Constitution is codified. It is written in a single document, whilst the UK Constitution isn't. And again, I've got this old story where if you want to demonstrate to a politics class which ones you do and don't like, is you ask the ones that you like to go and find you the US Constitution, because it's nice and straightforward and therefore a nice easy task them to do. And the ones that you want to get rid of for a long period of time, you tell them to go and find you the UK Constitution. It will take them a long while, they will scratch their heads and they might come back with a whole range of different things, but not actually the UK Constitution, because you cannot get hold of it and bring it in because it's in many different forms. This difference is largely down to the history of the two countries. The US was born out of the Revolutionary War. The founding fathers actually sat down and said, let's create a nation from scratch. And therefore they decided on their structures, they decided how their government was going to work, they decided on a whole range of different things, and they set it out in a document, and that document has survived, and that constitution has survived. In the UK, things have evolved over hundreds of years. We've seen the retreat of the power of the monarchy, we've seen the development of democracy, but we haven't seen that great big modern revolution, and therefore the UK has just kind of moved through time. And part of the reason that's allowed that is because there wasn't a codified constitution setting things out. They could evolve. It gave a great deal of flexibility. So the US Constitution is very much a product of the 18th century society that it comes out of, that had won independence from a distant imperial power, and therefore it worries about tyranny, and it worries about representation, and it worries about governments being too big and powerful, and particularly imposing taxes on tea and things that you don't want it to. Whilst the UK Constitution is, again, as I said, it's part of a reflection of a lack of revolution. It's actually one of the reasons for a lack of revolution as well. And because things can change quite easily, there's not really been a need to set it down, because as public opinion has changed, as those who can vote has changed, then things have just changed and moved along. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer in terms of which one of these is better. They are just different. And you will hear those in America who complain about how rigid their constitution is and talk about whether their constitution is out of date, and you'll hear those in the UK who will complain about that their constitution is too fluid and too flexible and that their rights aren't protected and written down anywhere. So again, you pay your money and take your choice, but that is a very much a difference between the two constitutions. So the sources of the Constitution is very different as well. So again, it's simple with the US Constitution, it's codified, therefore it's all in one single document. There have been 27 amendments, so if you get the Constitution, the 27 amendments, you've pretty much got almost all the story in terms of the US Constitution. Added on top of that, you're probably going to want to look at the Supreme Court, in particular key judgments that he has made in relation to the balance of power between state and federal government, between the different branches of government, things about the rights of people in America. And so the Supreme Court plays a really important role interpreting the Constitution, often referred to as the guardian of the Constitution. The UK Constitution is uncodified, therefore it has many sources. It has statute law, common law, conventions, authoritative works and treaties. And again, I really suggest to get the full deal on this, you go and find the UK Constitution video that I've done that goes through all of that in more detail. There is some similarity here, however, because there is a degree of vagueness in both constitutions. This leaves gaps for modern day politicians to find ways around what the Constitution tells them they're not allowed to do. So in America, we see things like executive orders, which have been extensively used by Trump, and have been used increasingly across all modern presidents. We see American presidents carrying out military actions because they are the commander-in-chief without declaring war, because that's the job of Congress. And there is this weird thing where America last declared war was World War II, and if any of you are students of modern history, you might look slightly perplexed to me at this moment, going, I'm sure there was Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf Wars. There were, but they weren't officially declared in that way, and so the president had a much freer hand. In the UK, we've seen recent confusion over the proroguing of Parliament again, and then very recently we've seen Priti Patel breaking the ministerial code but not resigning or being sacked, because there's a degree left open for interpretation. There's a degree of vagueness. It's not binding, that ministerial code, in the way that it might be if you had a codified constitution that said this is what happens if ministers do X, Y or Z. Well, we don't really have that. We have the code, but what the Prime Minister does with it is up to him. So in both countries, this degree of vagueness, this degree that things aren't absolutely locked down and certain, does lead to this a degree of movement. Looking at the provisions and principles, including separation of powers, checks and balances. So I'm going to look at separation of powers to start off with. Well, separation of powers is very strong in the US system. It's set to prevent anyone from being in two branches at the same time, pretty much. The president is elected separately from the legislature. The only slight crossover kicks in if the Senate is equally split and the vice president has a deciding vote. But other than that, we see very little connection between the two. We get the State of Union address, but the president can't control Congress, and Congress cannot completely control the president. And so we've got the three branches very clearly set out in the US. You've got the executive headed by the president, you've got the legislature made up of the two houses of Congress, and you've got the judiciary headed by the Supreme Court. Now the UK, in a way, is similar, because there are the three branches still. But it's really weak in the UK. The executive sits within the legislature and actually dominates it, with the PM coming from the biggest party, normally with the majority in the House of Commons, and almost all of his or her cabinet ministers coming out the House of Commons as well. Things have improved a bit in terms of separation of powers over more recent history, with the Supreme Court replacing the law lords. I mean, there was a bit where you could actually be part of all three branches at the same time, because again, so the law lord connection kind of blew all of that up. So we have some greater degree of separation of powers in the UK. there is a difference in terms of the location of power as well, because in the UK Parliament it is sovereign. That's where the sovereignty is. Whilst in the US it lies with the Constitution itself. And we do see an issue in the UK with this lack of separation of powers, which means that the executive, in certain circumstances, again, when the party in government has a large majority, is often seen as what is known as an elected dictatorship, where actually they can't really just do what they can really just do what they want. In the US, you don't really get that very often. It's very unusual for a president to be sat with both houses of Congress, being made up of the same party as them, and so a US president doesn't tend to have the freedom to carry out what they said they were going to do if elected that a UK prime minister does. And again, we're looking at a US election at the moment, but in 2020 it's all a bit up in the mix in terms of what's going to happen. But it looks like we're going to have Biden in the White House. We're going to have a Democrat House, but probably a Republican Senate, depending on how the runoffs go in Georgia. And if we go back to Trump, then from 2018 he's faced a Democrat-controlled House, and at which point his chances of doing very much have kind of diminished. Whilst in the UK we've got Boris Johnson with a large majority in the House of Commons, and so unless there is a large-scale backbench rebellion, then pretty much he can do as he and his cabinet wish. In terms of checks and balances, both the US and the UK have them, so there's a degree of similarity in there. Again, the difference is on the degree of the strength of these checks and balances. In the UK, Parliament can block government bills. Just look back over the whole Brexit saga. That we saw Parliament regularly defeating, first of all, May, and then in fairly record run at the beginning of his time in office, defeating Johnson. Parliament can essentially kick a government out, get rid of the executive through a vote of no confidence. The House of Lords can act as a check of sorts in that it can delay government decisions, but it's not a complete check, so it can't reject them. The Supreme Court can reverse government actions in the UK. But as I've said before, if the government is in a really strong position with a strong majority in the Commons, there's very little check on the Prime Minister's power. In the US, Congress can block President's bills, overturn his veto, reject his appointments and his treaties, though both of those last two are done by the Senate. They can impeach him. We've seen, and we saw that attempted with Trump, where he went to an impeachment trial in the Senate, which then found him not guilty. They could impeach other members of the executive or members of the top of the judiciary. Congress has the power of the purse, which means it controls all the money. It has the ability to declare war, and only Congress has the ability to declare war. And then the president has checks on Congress. It can veto their bills. The president has the power to nominate judges, and we've seen that with Trump and 3 appointments of the Supreme Court, changing very much the nature of the Supreme Court. The president is the commander-in-chief, and we've seen Trump even as a lame duck calling troops back to the US. The Supreme Court has a check on both elements of government, because it can deem laws passed through Congress or executive actions as being unconstitutional and therefore stop them. And any American citizen has the right to take things as far as the Supreme Court if they believe a law to be unconstitutional. So there are checks and balances in both systems, and so in that way they are similar, but the strength of those checks and balances is so incredibly different that we have that real strength of difference between the UK and the US. Both the US and the UK pride themselves on being liberal democracies and protecting the rights of their citizens. Now, the way that they do this is different, and you could argue that the strength of that protection is different as well. And the US seems to have the strongest system because it's got the Bill of Rights enshrining a whole range of key constitutional rights into constitutional law, which is superior to any other law in America, and therefore to get rid of them you'd have to amend the Constitution, and your chances of doing that are fairly slim because amendment is really difficult. And therefore, if any action of a government impinges on these rights, then citizens can challenge it and take it to the Supreme Court and have that action by the government thrown out, or that law passed by the government that impinges on that right removed. Hence, you will see the enormous difficulties if you want to try and do something to restrict gun use in America because of the Second Amendment, and that's really difficult to get rid of. So rights are brilliant in America, you would think. They're really well protected. Well, if you look at American record on civil rights, you look at the current actions by some in the American police, and therefore the growth of the Black Lives Matters movement, and they've done a huge amount to highlight the issues of minority groups within the US, and we've seen a lot of highly kind of difficult election and with high tempers on both sides over all of this. Then we can see America, yes, there are certain rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, but whether everybody is treated equally and has the same rights in America is up for a degree of debate. Now, in the UK, rights ultimately you could say are less secure. We have them, but they can be removed by acts of Parliament. Both nations have seen some similarities in this. There are certain things that challenge the idea of individual rights within both countries. Normally, the big example on this is anti-terror legislation, and we see real issues with that when they're conflicting with individual freedoms. And probably the most up-to-date example is all the stuff with COVID restrictions. And one of the things that you might notice, because of the culture in America regarding individual rights, the idea of government telling you what you can and cannot do and whether you should wear a mask and what can and cannot be shut face a lot stronger resistance in the US than they have in the UK. Amending the Constitution is very difficult in the US. It's a lot less flexible than the UK Constitution, and there's a whole procedure you have to go through. Having said that, both the US and UK constitutions can be changed, so there is a similarity there. In the UK, if a government dislike a judge's decision or feel an element of the Constitution is out of date, they can simply change it through an Act of Parliament. And again, as governments tend to have majorities in the House of Commons, and the House of Lords can only delay things, if they want to do that, then unless there's a really strong reaction from the public, then the chances are they can just do it. The UK does seem to be developing a new convention where if it's going to make a fundamental change to the UK Constitution, such as leaving the EU or changing the voting system or greater degrees of devolution or introducing devolution, it tends to now do it through referendum. The constitutional position of those is a bit woolly because because of parliamentary sovereignty they are non-binding, but there seems to be a new move, particularly since '97, that if something that is seen as a constitutional change is happening, it often goes to a public vote, but theoretically it can all just be done through an Act of Parliament. And actually what makes the change after the referendum isn't the referendum itself, but an Act of Parliament that follows. In the US, it's much tougher. The amendment procedure involves needing to get a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, so in the House of Representatives and also in the Senate, and then 3/4 of all states have to sign on and say that they agree. More frequently, challenges come down to, and changes in the way the Constitution is seen come through Supreme Court decisions, and that brings about that can bring about a degree of constitutional development. I mean, there was ideas amongst particularly what groups who call themselves conservatives in the US that the Supreme Court became too progressive and too liberal, and then therefore they disliked some of the changes of the Constitution that happened going back through 1969, 70s in particular, and the makeup of the court has now become a kind of key political issue, hence all the fuss about Donald Trump's appointments to the Supreme Court, and it's believed that those appointments might lead to changes in decisions on things like the Affordable Care Act and also abortion, possibly in the not too distant future. The US has a federal system and the UK has devolution. Now, you can argue these are very similar. Now, the US is a highly diverse country in which federalism has been a key part set out in the Constitution right since the very, very beginning. The UK is made up of 4 nations, but was for many centuries a unitary system where all the power lay in Westminster. Now, there has been an introduction of devolution since 1997, and so the UK seems to be moving closer to the US system. Having said that, the federal system in the US means that the states hold their rights and their power independently. They are not dependent on central government for them. This is not true in the UK. There are devolved institutions such as the Scottish Parliament. It has powers, but it is given to it by Westminster and could be taken off it by Westminster. In the UK, there is not a fully uniform system, and we've seen this with the West Lothian question and the idea of English votes for English laws, that there is a disparity here where we've got MPs in Westminster from Scotland and Wales, but we've got issues that only affect England, and Wales has a parliament, Scotland has a parliament, but Yorkshire doesn't, and is that the same? The powers in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament has a difference to the powers that the Welsh Parliament has. Again, we've got a different story again in Northern Ireland. So the US has a uniform system where all the different states have the same powers, whilst in the UK it's a bit more of a mess. Now, in theory, I've said that the devolution could just be overturned by an act of Parliament. However, that seems really now rather far-fetched. The challenge if a government decided to do that would be very, very strong. And then also this idea that states have this great deal of independence might also seem increasingly to be under threat in the states where the Supreme Court, a series of Supreme Court judgments and encroachment by federal government and the way that federal government hands out money to the states, all that starts to suggest that really maybe the states don't have that great degree of freedom that originally that they had, and therefore maybe they're not all that different from the devolved system in the UK. Right, in the next section of this video, I'm going to look at the rational, cultural, and structural approaches and how they can be used to account for similarities and differences. So first of all, I'm going to look at the rational approach. So this is based on how individuals act, based on self-interest. And now, because the Constitution regulates individual rights and the extent to which they can act rationally, therefore, this is an important way in which we can explain the differences and how the differences manifest themselves in the US and the UK. So in the US, the Supreme Court judges can take the advantage of the vagueness of the Constitution to interpret things in a way that suits their political perspective. This is much less the case in the UK, where you've got kind of very extensive pieces of legislation with therefore slightly less room for interpretation. This has therefore led to a greater politicization of the courts in America, particularly the Supreme Court, than we've seen in the UK. And therefore, this nature of the Constitution and rational choices that people can make because of it explains part of the difference of how the systems have developed. The US system has more elections and more frequent. These elections are more frequent, and this therefore gives more opportunity for people to express their views. They've got elections at whole different levels, and then also, for example, the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years, so you've got this kind of regular flow, and therefore this should mean that Americans are able to follow their own self-interest more regularly, and this should lead to a government system that is more responsive to public opinions and swings in public opinion over fairly short periods of time. And this means that American democracy develops in a different way, and again the degree of freedom and choice that the people of the two countries has is a development and a difference. I mean, obviously there's similarities in this as well, in that they get to vote in elections in the US, we get to vote in elections in the UK. They have different levels of elections in the US, we have different levels of elections in the UK. People get to express their rational choice. In terms of the cultural approach, this looks at the influence of groups such as political parties, pressure groups, factions, and follows the idea that people actually do based on the group they are in, and the groups have shared ideas, beliefs and values. Now obviously the constitutions, as I said earlier, are quite culturally set in the two countries and reflect the cultures of the two countries, and in a way have set up the cultures in the two countries. Now in the US, we see Democrats and Republicans clashing over the desirability and the degree there should be of states' rights. In the UK, we see the Conservatives clashing with other parties about the desirability of further devolution. I mean, we've seen a big fuss in recent weeks with Boris Johnson describing devolution as being a disaster, and then having to kind of clarify his remarks and there is obviously calls in Scotland for complete independence. So we see, because of the groups that are people in the political parties that they follow, we see differing views here, and this is a great similarity between the US and the UK, and this can affect the constitution and constitutional issues. Now, the culture around the protection of rights is much stronger in the US than it is in the UK, and you'll see this notably. One of the things the discussion often falls back into in my classroom is often people keep going back to the Second Amendment, which is something that people in the UK find it very hard to get their heads around, and so what we see in the UK is we see a difference, because changing cultural beliefs in the UK are more likely to bring about change, as there's greater flexibility in the constitution to do it. So for example, the introduction of gay marriage in Britain could be done with a lot less hoops to jump through and difficulty than it could be in the US, whilst and when it comes to things like gun control, you have a major incident in the UK like Dunblane, and then you see immediate reaction, and so a kind of removal of that culture. But because that right is set out in the Constitution, the culture amongst groups in America is very strong in favour of that ability to own guns, and therefore there's a great deal of defence if there's ever any kind of suggestion it might be watered down or removed. The structural approach is probably the best one if you're looking at a comparison of the Constitution, because it has the most obvious connection, because the Constitution set out the structures of the country's political systems. Therefore, a structural approach when looking at the constitutions is really important. The Constitution set out the separation of powers and checks and balances, so both countries have those, but as we've seen earlier, they are different in their degree. Both legislatures have the ability to check the executive. In the US, they're much stronger. The different constitutions set out where power is. So the US Constitution disperses sovereignty across the system, and a lot of it is retained in the Constitution itself, whilst in the UK sovereignty lies with Parliament, and therefore Parliament doesn't have the same restrictions placed on it as, for example, the Constitution places on Congress. There is a similarity. Both countries' constitutions set out a largely independent judiciary. Constitutions set out the amendment procedure, which again we've seen in the UK is much easier to get through and a lot less flexible in the US. Both countries set out a structure for regional power. Again, this is much more central to the US system, which has had the debate about federal government versus states' rights going all the way back to its absolute origin. Whilst the UK, we have had this huge period of unitary system, and then we've got a current system where we've got devolution, but that's not as securely set up as the federal system is in the US. So I hope that has been helpful for you, going through the comparison between the US and UK constitution and trying to address all those key different issues in terms of how they're similar, how they're different, and then the different approaches to looking at the Constitution. As I've said already, there are a whole series of videos in my A-level politics playlist, looking at the US Constitution, also looking at the UK Constitution, and looking at how to do the two different types of 12-mark question that you could be asked on this particular topic. So I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for watching. If it's been good and helped you, then please hit the like. If you haven't done already, then please subscribe, get notifications as I continue to add more government and politics videos, and there's also a whole range of history videos on here as well. And if you've got any questions or queries or anything you want to let me know, then please leave me something in the comments. Thank you very much for watching.